Welcome everyone to another YIVO Max Weinreich Center Fellowship lecture. Today's lecture is the recipient of the Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellowship. Dr. Andrei Schlachter is an international historian of the Soviet Union and its neighbors. His research explores the interaction of economics, security, and ideology at state frontiers. Dr. Schlachter received his PhD from the University of Chicago in December 2020 with the dissertation entitled Smuggler States, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Contraband Trade Across the Soviet Frontier, 1919 to 1924, which was honored with the 2021 Ab Imperio Annual Award and is a finalist for the 2022 Herman E. Cruz Prize for the Best Dissertation in Business History. Since taking his degree, Dr. Schlachter has been a Gerchik Visiting Scholar at the University of Toronto, a Title VIII Research Scholar at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center, the 2021 Fisher Fellow at the Virtual Summer Research Laboratory at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and most recently, the 2021-2022 Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellow in Eastern European Jewish Studies at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, where he conducted archival research for his postdoctoral book project, Smuggling Across Soviet Borders, Contraband Trade, Soviet Solutions, and the Shadow Economic Origins of the Iron Curtain, 1917 to 1932. And I just want to point out that if you enjoyed today's lecture, I'd like to consider donating to YIVO because we're able to provide these free lectures only based on your support, which we greatly appreciate. So without further ado, Dr. Schlachter.
Okay, thank you so much, Eddie, and Ashena Dank. So YIVO, and a special thank you to the Abramovich Fellowship for making this possible, the research and the talk. So just a quick caveat, this talk is about a research project in progress, and as such it may be less polished and a little more tentative in some ways than the kind of book talks that folks may be used to. But it's been very useful for me to pull together what I understand on this topic so far, and I hope it will be at least somewhat useful for you. So I'm going to share the screen here. Can you see a slideshow, Eddie?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, fantastic. All right. On a cold April night in 1926, one Gerchik Botvinnik was apprehended by Soviet border guards while riding in his horse-drawn cart along a Belarusian country road just northwest of Minsk. This would be right around here. Among the wads of bills that the soldiers found stuffed in his pockets were over $400 US, equal to around $6,000 today. An investigation determined that Botvinnik obtained the dollars earlier that night by selling saccharin that had been smuggled in from nearby Poland. While Botvinnik had not smuggled the saccharin across the border himself, he arranged such operations personally, crossing furtively into Poland, negotiating with Polish merchants, and paying with the currency desired on both sides of the border, US dollars. Botvinnik's case was one of hundreds of thousands of seizures of contraband effected by Soviet authorities in the 1920s in a far-reaching struggle against smuggling. To give a little bit of a sense of scale, this is seizures of contraband goods in the USSR, known annual totals. This is based on my research on former Soviet archives and the published Soviet customs records. So as you can see, it was quite a substantial activity. And these are, of course, only the interceptions. So this is only a fraction of the actual smuggling involved. But the US banknotes that financed his operations were some of the millions of dollars that American Jews sent to their Soviet brethren with the Soviet government's active encouragement. As I will show, the mixing of these two flows, the legal transatlantic remittances and the cross-border contraband in Botvinnik's pockets that night, was not merely a curious coincidence. Indeed, all the elements of Botvinnik's encounter with the Soviet border guards, including the protagonist, a Jew, the place near the Polish border, the time, a night in the mid-1920s, and the currency, US dollars, formed part of a wider web. If not quite a worldwide web, then at least one that traversed Europe, Asia, and North America, with some strands reaching as far south as Africa and South America. By tracing some of these threads, we'll uncover connections, hidden connections between people, places, and processes, reflect on what these links reveal, and consider their consequences. So a bit of background. Why did contraband trade across the Soviet borders flourish so much in the 1920s? Well, there are at least two sides to every border. So let's first consider the Soviet side. There's a bit of recent history. The period from 1917 through 1921 saw unprecedented shortages of consumer goods due to war. Continued fighting with Germany until the spring of 1918, civil wars, interventions by neighboring states and the great powers, the opportunity costs of war, resources mobilized for the armies, physical devastation, deurbanization as workers fled hungry cities to native villages, and the attendant collapse of factory output. So just by way of one illustration, you can see the kind of archetypal consumer good, cotton cloth, during this period. About half the households still made their own clothing. You can see a complete collapse of output during the Civil War years. So at the same time, as production collapsed, the Bolshevik assault on private trade hamstrung distribution and engendered an entire culture of illegal shuttle trading called bagging, meshochnичество, with armies of bagmen shuttling between cities and countryside, trying to evade the authorities in the process. And as you can see, why we call them bagmen, of course, many were in fact bag women. Moreover, the Soviet state monopoly on foreign trade, formally adopted in 1918, in April 1918, criminalized all private commercial links with the outside world. This was not entirely a Bolshevik innovation. The Tsarist and provisional governments, like other nations in wartime, had imposed significant restrictions on foreign trade to better muster resources for the war effort. Such mobilizational concerns also drove the Bolsheviks, but they had their own reasons too. Total state control of foreign trade was seen as a cornerstone of the planned economy that the Bolsheviks hoped to build. Committed to industrialization, they saw the state monopoly as, quote, the highest form of protectionism that would shield Soviet industry from foreign competition. And most immediately, they worried about husbanding exportable raw materials such as flax and furs, and convertible valuables such as precious metals and stones and hard currency. And indeed, concern about the unchecked outflow of portable valuables was especially acute in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik takeover in November 1917 and animated early Soviet border control measures. It was a remarkable about-face for millenarian internationalists who had hoped to make both valuables and borders obsolete. And it also proved to be the most persistent concern in discussions of smuggling over the course of the 1920s, as Botvinnik would experience personally. There were other factors limiting Soviet foreign trade in those early years. The devastated state of both the railways and the fleet, the blockade by allies, general sort of mistrust of the Bolsheviks, and so on. But fundamentally, the state monopoly on foreign trade rendered import decisions less responsive to popular demand. Now, in March 1921, the Bolsheviks adopted the new economic policy. This legalized private trade, ended bagging, factories resumed production of consumer goods, and you could see the recovery of cotton cloth production in that graph earlier. The Foreign Trade Commissariat imported for the peasant market because no longer were the Bolsheviks simply requisitioning grain. They wanted to be able to trade for it. And at the same time, smuggling, by all accounts, only increased. Why? Well, I identify sort of three major reasons. One, front lines turning into frontiers. So shadow economies are commonly considered to be the offspring of anarchy. But smuggling thrives on a measure of order, replacing fluid front lines with fixed but porous frontiers. Peace made smuggling a more predictable and less dangerous proposition. But for a contraband economy to thrive, in the words of one scholar, the border had to be porous to traders, but impermeable to policing from the other side. And only when state boundaries were both existing and porous could people make use of them. Then, of course, we had shortages and recovery. So on the one hand, shortages persisted. Pre-war output and import levels would not be reached for years to come, for some goods never. Distribution difficulties were especially pronounced at the edges of Soviet territory. And yet, economic recovery spurred consumer demand, including increasingly for high-end goods. Conspicuous consumption, which had been outright dangerous during the previous period, known as war communism, in fact became a hallmark of the NEP. And that included sartorial signaling. Dressing well became a necessity in an economy with quite a bit of private activity. And finally, something I call commercial camouflage. So a vibrant and growing private trade network actually supplied the ideal soil for contraband trade. The bustling shops and stalls provided the contraband trade with a basis of operations. And the sheer ubiquity of commerce under the NEP meant, to borrow another scholar's phrase, that the state was somewhat blinded by the frenzy of activity. The legal marketplace, both literal and figurative, made contraband easier to buy and to sell and harder to detect. And just by way of illustration, this is Sukharevsky Market, major market in Moscow, and you can see people packed elbow to elbow. This is more or less a smuggler's dream and a policeman's nightmare. And the flourishing of the contraband trade under the NEP actually underscores the symbiotic relationship between authorized and illicit economic activity. So that's on the Soviet side. But what about the other side, the neighbors? Now, for the Soviet states' neighbors, let's go back a little bit. Yeah. For the Soviet states' neighbors, scarcities on the Soviet side, whether of necessities or of luxuries, meant opportunity. And this was especially significant for those new nations for whom the loss of the imperial Russian market had been the price of independence. I'm talking here in particular about Poland, Latvia, and Estonia. Finland also to a lesser extent. And the ensuing dynamic, something I explore in the dissertation, I call fear and longing. So, of course, these new nations had much to fear. They feared hungry Russian hordes, especially with the onset of famine in Russia and in the context of post-war food insecurity. They feared epidemic diseases. They feared Bolshevik subversion. They feared Russian rule in red garb. They feared Jews as inherently undesirable and as vectors of all of the above. But there was also quite a bit of longing in the economic sense. So to take just one example, between 1880 and 1910, Kingdom Poland's exports to the rest of the Romanov Empire grew nearly 11-fold, dwarfing Polish exports to the West. And textiles, the production of which was concentrated in the rapidly growing Western Polish city of Łódź, known as the Polish Manchester, were central to this traffic. Between 1879 and 1911, Poland's export of cloth to the Tsar's other domains grew over 20-fold. And by 1910, the major textile goods comprised nearly 70% of the value of the Polish eastbound flow. So this is an economy that is incredibly enmeshed in this imperial network. And if we look at some data on contraband confiscated by the Soviets over the 1920s, this is a Soviet customs publication. We see, in fact, a real concentration in the textile and sartorial domain. So here we have weight in kilograms and the price that these goods fetched at auction. And all of these here are various kinds of cloth, knitwear, and the like. And so this was a way for these neighboring states to reclaim some of that lost market. Now, interestingly, this is the first very long section, well, nearly 50 different kinds of goods. This is contraband imports, so goods that were confiscated for being smuggled into the country. It's a much smaller section for contraband exports. And there are several reasons for that. One is there's an inherent source bias in that goods were, when smuggled in, were much easier to catch because you could catch them at the very border or anywhere in the interior. Goods being smuggled out, much harder to catch. You can only really catch them at the border itself. But also the nature of the goods being smuggled out. Russia did not have such a great variety of things. Russian smugglers did not have such a great variety of things with which to pay. These tended to be either portable raw materials, like wool, horsehair, furs potentially. In the Far East, it tended to be gold dust and the like, but also hard currency features quite prominently. And this is actually only a fraction of even what was captured, because not all of it was handed over to customs. So naturally the question arises, where does this hard currency come from? And by the way, I have sources from both sides of the border indicating the particular prevalence of US dollars, especially on the Polish border, going to pay for imported Polish contraband, cloth, and the like. So the question is, where did these dollars come from? Well, before the revolution, the money that Eastern European immigrants sent back was enough to tip the international balance of payments. During 1902 to 1906 alone, American money orders totaling some $70 million were cashed in Russia and Austria-Hungary, and many other remittances surely arrived by other means. According to one report, by the outbreak of the First World War, American Jews were sending to their brethren in the Russian Empire about $13 million a year, the equivalent of over $370 million today. Now, more research is certainly needed to understand these numbers, and one thing that I myself would like to understand is what portion of these remittances were paid out in dollars versus rubles. The recipients before the revolution did not have much reason not to take Tsarist rubles, which were stable on the gold standard. So I don't know to what extent these pre-war remittances might have formed a ready reserve of convertible currencies for use in post-war smuggling. But the point is that transatlantic remittances were an established feature of life in the Pale before the war and a lifeline for the recipients. The outbreak of war rendered the recipients both more desperate and severed these flows. As the historian Jacqueline Granick has documented in her wonderfully rich recent book, International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of the Great War, the philanthropic American Jewish organizations that emerged in response to the war worked assiduously to rebuild and leverage these pre-war connections for the purposes of relief. And the war, of course, presented tremendous logistical challenges. And moreover, the US government, to say nothing of the allies in Europe, was not in favor of shipping supplies that might fall into enemy hands, something that became an ever greater concern as German and Austrian forces marched east through the Pale. And this is a wonderful map from Granick's book showing the progression of the Eastern Front through the Pale. Now, currency remittances were easier and faster to move, and they could be better targeted to specific populations and individuals, and they did not immediately increase the quantity of supplies on enemy territory. So Granick has found, working through private banks, the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, which was the major umbrella organization in charge of relief, was able to send funds to Jews in over 250 towns in German-occupied Poland and Lithuania. While much of this was community-level relief, the JDC also pioneered the resumption of individual remittances through its transmission bureau. And this is a photograph of one such bureau operating. Granick indicates that this is most likely from in a couple of years after the war. So these are people lining up in New York to wire money to their loved ones in Europe. And in the Yavor archives, I found some of these remittance slips that would have been filled out. Perhaps they're holding some of them right here in this photograph. This is a wartime remittance slip. In fact, it says here, remittance for occupied territories, a term we tend to hear in a different context in both English and Yiddish. And there are certain limitations on how much could be wired and how regularly and so on. And there's a tear-off slip here on the bottom. And then this is a post-war remittance slip. Now you have the countries marked out separately: Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Austria, and Palestine. So Granick has found that these remittances were generally paid out in local currency, so they were unlikely to have been a major source of dollars for the post-war contraband trade. And they did not yet reach into territory that would become Soviet after the war. But they ensured the continuation of the pre-war tradition of individual remittances, encouraged the tracing of relatives, and forced both US State Department officials and American Jewish organizations to wrangle with the moral, strategic, legal, and logistical obstacles to sending money into uncertain and even hostile territory. The US entry into the war in April 1917 made the State Department more restrictive in regulating where remittances could go, especially as Germany grabbed more territory in the East. after the Bolshevik takeover in November 1917. But as Granick argues, US officials also came to see American remittances and indeed aid more broadly as a form of soft power and an important element for winning hearts and minds in contested territories. When it came to sending remittances to Bolshevik Russia, however, the US government initially took a more prohibitive approach. Thus, in July 1918, the State Department rejected a proposal by Public National Bank of New York for sending private remittances. And then the outbreak of full-fledged civil war across the former Russian Empire, including the unprecedented violence visited on Ukrainian Jews in the pogroms of 1919, made the delivery of remittances virtually impossible in any event. When Polish forces pushed east into Soviet Ukraine in the spring of 1920, JDC representatives followed, delivering both general relief and even individual remittances. So I have not yet been able to determine the volume or the currency. But this was brief. The Bolsheviks counterattacked in the summer of 1920, even reaching Warsaw, and these efforts were rapidly wound down. With the end of the Russian Civil War and the Soviet-Polish War and the establishment of Bolshevik control, it became clear that relief efforts, including private remittances, would have to go through official Soviet channels. Now, Bolshevik leaders were quite excited about the prospect of dollar remittances, but they wanted to keep the dollars while paying the recipients rubles. Moreover, there was no legal foreign currency market in Soviet Russia under war communism. In the fall of 1920, JDC representatives met with the Soviet ambassador to Estonia. Estonia was a kind of window to the West at this point, through which much of legal Soviet trade was channeled. And tried to negotiate a system for delivering remittances. They initially came to a tentative agreement where there would be a rate of 1,000 rubles to the dollar. The official here writes, this would be inoffensive to the Americans and profitable for us. But for whatever reason, the Soviet representative in New York soon demanded a much more exorbitant rate of just a quarter as many rubles to the dollar. And this invited an investigation by the State Department, and the remittances, some may have gone through, but this was not a promising flow. But the introduction of the new economic policy in Soviet Russia in spring 1921 gradually opened up a whole other set of possibilities. And these were made possible by personal connections, both high level and low level, between American and Soviet Jews. The key character was Sidney Hillman, born Simcha Gilman in Lithuania in the Russian Empire. Hillman studied in the yeshiva to become a rabbi, but joined the Marxist underground and eventually the Jewish Socialist Bund. After the Tsarist repressions that followed the 1905 revolution, Hillman fled to Germany, then moved to England, and then to the United States, first Chicago, then New York. Hillman played a leading role in the establishment of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America in 1914, which would soon become the major union in the clothing industry. Eastern European Jewish immigrants, or the children of immigrants, made up the core membership and much of the leadership. While communists never became a dominant force in the Amalgamated, the Union took a broadly pro-Soviet stance, lobbied against the Allied blockade of Soviet Russia, lobbied for famine relief, and for a normalization of relations. Hillman traveled to Moscow in August 1921, where he met Lenin and other top Bolshevik leaders, and was impressed with the promise of the NEP for Russia's reconstruction and what he perceived rather rosily as workers' control of industry. During this trip and another one in fall 1922, he developed plans for the Amalgamated to invest in the Russian clothing industry. In Moscow, Hillman found an enthusiastic partner in Alexander Krasnoshokov, a top Bolshevik economic official who had spent many years in the United States, even graduating from the University of Chicago Law School. And they may have known each other from left-wing activities before the revolution. Together, Hillman and Krasnoshokov founded the Russian-American Industrial Corporation, which helped bring American machinery, expertise, and investment into the Soviet clothing industry. The story of the Reich remains in the Russian archives and indeed remains to be told. There's very little work on it that has been done. But for the purposes of my subject, its significance was twofold. One, by improving Soviet clothing production, it formed part of what Soviet officials would later refer to as, quote, the economic struggle with contraband, the effort to produce the kinds of goods that would otherwise be smuggled. And on the other hand, it formed a key link in rebuilding the chain of remittances. This is because, as part of its commitment to providing more services to its members and leveraging its membership, the financial power of its members, the Amalgamated, the union of which Hillman was president, opened a bank in Chicago, the Amalgamated Trust and Savings Bank, in July 1922, and made plans to open another bank in New York. Krasnoshokov, for his part, was also a pioneer of the Soviet banking sector and sat on the governing board of the Bank of Trade and Industry. Hillman and Krasnoshokov signed an agreement to facilitate remittances. A crucial concession that Hillman was able to secure was that the remittances would now be paid out in US dollars. And so, on February 18th, 1923, one of the Soviet Union's two chief dailies, Izvestia, carried just under the masthead a tantalizing advertisement that ran the length of the page and disappeared seductively under the fold. Dollars received from America. It listed the names and the towns and names of hundreds of recipients, overwhelmingly Jewish, primarily in Ukraine and Belorussian. Now, one might imagine that the recipients were happy to finally receive remittances, but perhaps not thrilled to have this kind of advertising for their neighbors to read and for people around the Soviet Union to read more broadly. And this was a long-standing concern, whether, and this is something that the JDC was quite concerned about earlier, how to avoid fomenting anti-Semitism. But here, with even as providing aid, here the Soviets decided that there's no such thing as bad publicity, and in fact, here they appeal to others to write to their relatives so that they would then send them money through the Amalgamated. And similar advertisements appeared in other Soviet newspapers as well. And here's just one example of the kind of advertising that took place stateside as the Amalgamated expanded its business for remittances and eventually to other countries as well. And it would have agents who would pay a certain commission and so on. And here's actually a view of the Amalgamated Bank in Union Square. In 1928, they initially had occupied a smaller space, but because of the sheer volume of the remittance business, by 1926, they took over the full Tiffany's building here. And just to give some sense of these flows, we're talking hundreds of thousands of remittances sent, worth millions of dollars. So just over this period here, from 1923 through 1927, there was something like 600,000 individual remittances, totaling over $17 million sent just through these two banks, the New York and the Chicago Amalgamated. Now, it would seem that they're tapering off, but my understanding is that this is not indicative of a sudden drop-off in remittances overall, so much as the fact that other players entered what was a big business. And so, and in reviewing some of the records of the Amalgamated, they talk about the difficulty and the competition. And indeed, from published Soviet sources, I was able to find that remittances actually stayed constant, or fairly constant, during the 20s, and then only fell off rather precipitously at the end of the decade. There's probably several reasons for this, and I was hoping to do more research on this in the Russian archives. It was actually supposed to be in Moscow now. Putin had other plans. But one can imagine there are probably several reasons for why the remittances tapered off. At the end of the 20s, one was the Great Depression. People had less money to send. Another was that the Soviets established in 1930 a system of stores on which people could transfer remittances, and where their relatives could obtain products. And this was a way for the Soviets to pocket the dollars. But this was, of course, after the end of the NEP and the commencement of the first 5-year plan, and the resumption of an administrative command economy. One thing that I found particularly intriguing was that there were also a fair amount of remittances being sent from the USSR, which suggests to me that at least some of these remittances going to the USSR might have been not simply charity, but a kind of investment in all sorts of things, possibly including smuggling. So that's something that I need to dig out a little more. So I've been trying to map the many flows involved here, and this is, as I said, a work in progress. So I'm still working it out, but just to give some sense of these transatlantic flows, you have the remittances going from Jews in New York and elsewhere. They use the money to buy textiles and garments made in Poland. The basic ingredient for the Polish textile industry was, in fact, American cotton. Nearly 90% was American before the revolution. They had been using Russian cotton. After the revolution, they had to switch. And some cotton came from colonial possessions, the European colonial possessions in Africa, and so on. There's also a big circulation of furs, both contraband and not. And New York was the center of sort of the world fur industry, and heavily Jewish industry at that. In fact, you can still see some of the sort of ghost signs if you walk around the city of the furriers that were such a mainstay. So this is all to say that I think one of the takeaways here is that we can see, yes, there was an ocean in between and different systems and so on, but I think it helps to imagine the Soviet borderlands and the Lower East Side as part of a linked economic space, and that I think is one of the takeaways. There are other takeaways and consequences in the broader project. I argue that the Soviet struggle with contraband was one of the a primary driver of the buildup of the Soviet border control system in the 1920s, the physical infrastructure that would eventually become the Iron Curtain. And so, in a paradoxical kind of way, the financing that was coming from the United States in these private remittances actually helped stimulate the contraband trade and then, by extension, the border buildup by the Soviets. There were other sort of sadder aftershocks in the early 1930s as the Stalinist leadership tried to find hard currency in sort of every way it could. Recipients of remittances, those who had received remittances over the course of the 20s, were targeted. Some were tortured, and some were forced basically to wire their relatives requests for more money, and so on. And so this is one of the kind of sadder aftershocks of that story. But as I said, I'm still working out the takeaways and the implications here. One final thing I want to say is that this is a very decentralized and hidden story in many ways. And this is something actually that Jacqueline Granick talks about in her book, that it's hard to get there's so many players involved, and this is primarily a private endeavor. And so there isn't one central archive to which you can go to understand these remittance flows. And so I would actually like to appeal to audience members, because I imagine that there must be some trace, some record in private family papers and the like of this story. And that really, I think, would be wonderful to be able to draw on that. So I'll stop here, and I know I have probably left a lot of loose ends, so I hope perhaps we can pick up on that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, for a really quite an interesting talk, an interesting topic. This was really fascinating, and we'll get to the questions that people asked, but I have a number of questions. This is so fascinating to me. Let me start by asking if you're able. I mean, obviously, this is a very specific moment you're dealing with in time, and I'm just wondering if you could sort of more broadly situate the smuggling that's taking place during the years you're focusing on with a larger history of Jewish smuggling. It's my understanding that this was not an uncommon aspect of life in Eastern Europe, or really elsewhere. Smuggling exists everywhere, and I'm just wondering if there's sort of a broader way to frame all of this.
Yeah, for sure. So here I try to focus on the transatlantic connections. But of course, the local Jewish connections were probably even more important. And yes, like you say, there's a long history here. The borders that came down in 1921, the Soviet-Polish border, for example, were an accident. They were the result of front lines becoming frontiers. And as such, they bifurcated communities, including Jewish communities. So those kinds of ties, of course, remained very salient and proved operative in powering the contraband trade. One sort of deeper kind of Jewish story there that I found is that Jewish merchants had been very important in connecting the Polish textile industry with the imperial Russian market over the preceding decades. And it appears that the major impetus for this was actually the influx of Jews west in the wake of the persecutions in the 1880s, because those Jews that moved west into Poland retained their connections east, and those were really instrumental in ensuring that Polish textiles flowed east, and those connections remained operative after the revolution as well. So I think Jewish connections play a fundamental role in making this possible, in fact, reviving, keeping afloat the Polish economy after independence. But of course, at the same time, naturally opened up the Jews to anti-Semitism on the basis of these very same connections.
Right, and actually, in connection to that, one thing I found very interesting was this advertisement in Izvestia that you showed, listing people who had received money from abroad. That strikes me as incredibly dangerous for the people who received the money. And I guess from the point of view of the newspaper or of the government who's asking them to do that, it distinctly puts these people into some sort of awkward position, where suddenly all their neighbors know that they're flush with cash. Do you know of the results of adverse results that occurred because of these things?
Yeah, this is one of those things that I hope to eventually pursue further in the former Soviet archives, because of course the Bolsheviks were very, at least in the 1920s, were very anti-Semitic, right? So this was something that they would have been quite concerned about. But here, the sort of hard currency concerns probably trumped. So I can imagine there were some hard discussions in the editorial offices and so on. But ultimately, they decided that hard currency is most important, and more important even than potentially fomenting anti-Semitism. So that's an interesting point, maybe in itself. But I think this is a very fraught kind of moment, and I think there's probably more stories there.
Yeah, doubtlessly. One other thing that I found interesting was the fact that there were auctions for stolen goods in the Soviet Union. Auctions to me seems like such a bourgeois phenomenon, and obviously the NEP is in existence. Who's buying the materials from the stolen goods? Like I would imagine that in the Soviet Union they would donate them to factories. But
no, this was, this was a system that had been in place before the revolution, and in the immediate post-revolutionary period, yes, they thought, okay, well, if any illicitly procured goods that we capture, we need to donate to social services and the like. But very quickly, they realized that the best way to incentivize border guards to capture contraband is through rewards, and the rewards could be quite substantial. They were a portion of the value of the goods, and the way to obtain the most value was to sell these goods at auction, where perhaps state organizations might obtain some advantage, maybe first dibs, but ultimately this was an incentive-driven system where they figured that, and figured on the basis of experience, that border guards do better when they are rewarded, and the only way to reward them was to turn these goods into money. Now, one of the many effects of legally selling on legal auctions contraband goods is that they then were purchased by private traders who used them to camouflage goods that were bona fide contraband, right? Because you can put on top some goods that you bought at the customs auction, and then that makes it easier for you to sell goods that were in fact smuggled. And there's all sorts of shenanigans of that sort. But yeah, no, that's a kind of very multi-dimensional part of the story.
Wow, so fascinating. The one last thing I'll ask before we get to questions from the audience is, you showed a chart that indicated how much the Soviets were able to catch, or how much was confiscated coming through the border. Is there any way to estimate what made it through?
Yeah, so this is obviously really complicated, something that they wrestled with quite a bit. And there are individual attempts made on the basis of estimating the purchasing power of the population, pre-revolutionary demand, and so on. None too successful. It is something, of course, that varied tremendously over time. It varied with, it was a function of how much was produced domestically, how much was imported legally, the intensity of border patrol, the weather, the legal environment. There were just so many factors. I was able to get some sense of scale when looking at records from the other side, and so on. But it's difficult to say, because these are not perfectly comparable records, how much was, what percentage was being captured when. But they tossed around different kinds of percentages, I think, often because bureaucrats feel that they need to say something, and that numbers have a certain cachet, but in reality they just didn't know.
Right. Now, some people in the Q&A are asking about the remittances that you talked about. I think there's sort of a not so much clarity on what they actually are, who they're going to, how they're getting there. Maybe you could sort of describe that process a bit. And part of the same question is, are Jews sending most of these, or are non-Jewish immigrants also, I assume they were, sending money to their relatives in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so this is the mechanics of it are something I was still working out, but the crucial point was that these were dollars remitted and dollars paid out, right? And so that's what made it relevant for my story. And this was the sort of the big achievement of the amalgamated bank, and then other banks followed. Because that insured against currency depreciation and inflation and the like. But the exact sort of mechanisms, the interbank transfers and the like, I'm still still working out. In terms of who was sending it, well, I was most interested in the money going to the former Pale, and the makeup of the amalgamated membership was heavily Jewish. So that's where they were sending the money. Others I know also use the same services, and they talk about in their promotional materials, Poles and Lithuanians, because this was reliable. I've seen also some evidence of Canadian dollars going through the Ukrainian diaspora and playing a role here too. And so, yeah, but these are good questions. I just don't have satisfactory answers at the moment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously you're dealing with smuggling, and one kind of interesting thing is your dissertation is up for an award for the best business dissertation, and it just struck me that smuggling is a business. It's not, just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's not a business, and it's not something I'd really thought of, or at least I considered previously. Okay, more questions. Well, one person asks, why ask Jews to send money when the top there that you posted an advertisement to send money to your relatives. There was half in English and half in Yiddish, and in Yiddish it said send money for Passover, and in English it said send money for Easter. Mm-hmm. So obviously, I think that they figured that Passover was Easter in English, and this is the person's just asking, why would you send money for Easter?
Well, there's definitely a seasonality in these remittances, and I haven't yet figured out if that translates into or if that contributes to any kind of seasonality in the contraband trade itself, because the contraband trade has its own seasonality and was probably determined by other factors, not least weather, because you can either roads become passable or not, and the like. But Passover was actually always, for remittances, was always a spike. And I think this is because they wanted to make sure that their loved ones had enough money to afford all the things that go into a Seder and the like. But this is part of the kind of rhythm of life in the Pale, I think, was the receipt of remittances around Passover.
Sure, that makes sense. And we'll just take a couple more questions. Someone's asking, to what degree did Russian bureaucracy participate in the smuggling? And were there organized smuggling cartels, and to what degree was organized crime on both sides of the border involved in smuggling?
Yeah, so corruption, obviously, a big part of this story. On both sides, more corruption earlier because there's a relationship between poverty and corruption, and as sort of quality of life for Soviet bureaucrats improved, the temptation lessened, and so on. There was actually quite a bit of what was known as contraband camouflage by Soviet agents, Soviet intelligence agents, Soviet saboteurs, because the identity of a smuggler was the easiest disguise. And so for crossing the border back and forth, secret police agents, intelligence agents, actually from both sides, often took contraband with them, because this was the best, readiest, simplest explanation for why you were going every which way. So there's also kind of illegalized smuggling, and this created its own slew of problems, because some of the intelligence agents who were using smuggling to disguise their intelligence activities ended up essentially using their intelligence activities as an excuse to engage in very profitable trafficking, and so on. But yeah, it is a big part of the story. And there are organizations that they uncover. It's not always clear if they are sort of making these organizations to be more organized than they are, because there's always more cachet in uncovering an organization and then in individuals, but so on. But definitely as smuggling became a more professional activity over the course of the 20s, there was a kind of hierarchization and I guess you could say organization.
Great. All right, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Please join me in giving our thanks to Dr. Andrei Schlachter, the YIVO's Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellow for 2021-2022. We hope all of you enjoyed today's lecture. And if you did, please consider making a donation to YIVO. We are not able to provide these things without your help. Once again, thanks so much and have a good day.